All right, so can you re-ask the question that you just asked?
What would happen if you put a Blu-ray disc in a DVD player?
All right, so what happens if you put a Blu-ray disc in a DVD player? So as a reminder, the chunk of plastic, the three of these, the CD, the DVD, and Blu-ray, are carved on exactly the same piece of plastic. So let me hurry and pull one out. So same plastic, absolutely nothing is different about it. The only difference is the size of holes that get carved into the CD. For the pit or hole that represents the 1 is bigger. The LAN that represent the flat spot representing the 0 is bigger. So the carvings are bigger on a CD. When we move to the DVD, the carvings are smaller, which is why more can fit on a DVD, because they're smaller carvings, more holes or not holes can get carved onto the surface. And then when we get to the Blu-ray, even smaller holes get carved to represent the 1s, or flat spots to represent our 0s. So that's why even more can get stored. If you remember from Friday's bookcases assignment, there's 6 times more can be stored on Blu-ray than DVD, because the holes are 6 times smaller than the DVD. So what happens if you put Blu-ray in a DVD player? So the carvings and the information, only difference is size. However, if you remember, digital is a code that has to be interpreted by something. So the equipment that is just for CDs, it uses a laser that's bigger, and so it's a bigger wave that can recognize the size of holes that are there. When we get to a DVD player, it's a smaller laser wave that can recognize those sizes. When it's a Blu-ray player, it's an even smaller light wave or laser wave that recognizes the holes. So a DVD can get put in a Blu-ray player and played because the small wave can recognize the big holes. But if you put a Blu-ray into the DVD player and it's a big laser wave, it doesn't recognize most of those holes because the wave is too big to recognize that size. And so that's why DVD players can't read Blu-ray, because the waves are too big to notice most of the holes that are there. But the DVD can be read in Blu-ray because the smaller wave notices the bigger holes and can still read it. Does that answer your question? So very valid question. Yes?
Do you think that they'll eventually get even more smaller holes and then just a smaller scan?
Part of the limitations on how small they can get, blue is the smallest wavelength of light, but also the smaller the wavelength of light gets, the more energy that it carries. So there's that fine line, more energy can cause more damage. Kind of like, because when you get smaller than blue light, we start getting into ultraviolet, and that's what sunburns us. So just imagine what that slightly smaller wavelength can do to our skin that the visible blue light doesn't, that it can cause more damage to the materials. So it would be possible, they just would have to make sure they have materials that are not affected by the higher energy of the smaller waves.
So then how come kind of things like if you play on like video game consoles and stuff, how come they don't work in all the different ones? Because they'd have the same sized stuff on there, wouldn't they?
The biggest difference is the software, because the software is what interprets the code. So a Blu-ray player has software to read the code to turn it into a movie. Computers, depending on what software you have downloaded or you've purchased to put on the computer, can be software to do movies, to do games, to do a lot of different things. So it's the software, and even like what's on your phone. Where's my phone? And if you don't do updates on your phone, you don't get the software updates that keep your phone running smooth and the apps running smooth. So the software is what interprets the code and tells the device what to do with it. And so that's where those distinctions start coming in. Because we have software on our phone that can record sound and replay sound and digitize it. We've got software that can take pictures. We have software that can do the games if we've got the app, because that's the software piece. So the computers of our phone can do a lot of different things because we have a lot of software stored on our phone. So that's a good, valid question. All right, so I want you guys to make sure you have out your yellow papers from yesterday, because I want you to make sure you have the right numbers. So quickly take a minute, get out your music papers from yesterday, because I'm going to highlight the numbers about our digital formats in this style. And I want you to make sure you've got the numbers that go along with that. Because on the test tomorrow, I want to remind you, 11 of the 16 points of that test comes from your answer on what's more reliable for storing and transmitting information, the structure of digital or structure of analog. And you're going to need, it's the one that's stapled that's got the stuff with music on it. You're going to need 4 pieces of evidence. That evidence needs to be very specific, not generalizations. Half of that, so that means at least 2, needs to have data. So thinking about whatever your choice might be, the pros and the data for the one you want to choose, and then the cons of the one you're not, and data that goes along with that. That's the kind of stuff you're wanting to make sure you're using as evidence on the test. So making sure you've got the right numbers so you can make the evaluation and decide the best evidence to prove your claim is very helpful. All right, so we've got basic difference between how binary is stored on these 3 disks. So how much of our music does that end up being? So our CD came out in the 80s, started replacing the compact cassette. And that CD, it took, where'd the number go? 44,100 samples of sound per second. So that's a lot of sound, even though it's only fragments of information. It's that 44,100 samples per second got turned into the ones and zeros that got carved on this. Did you have a question?
I think I was going to ask for that.
Okay, I've got one right here. I'm just going to grab that. All right, so as the computer does its thing, it results in 30 megabytes of data being able to be stored. So that idea and those numbers are relevant. How that relates to how much music, it ends up being at that sample rate, 75 to 80 minutes of sound can be stored on a CD. So that's almost double what could be stored on a compact cassette, and they similar size about. Some benefits with that, because yes, CDs can get scratched, but because it's code, a lot of times the software can recognize whether or not there was supposed to be a hole or not, to know whether it was supposed to be a 1 or a 0. So a lot of times software can filter out those scratches unless they're really bad, damaging a lot of the data. Another huge convenience, do you guys remember when I talked last week about when you were listening to music and you didn't like a song, what you had to do?
Yeah.
You'd have to fast forward and then play, oh, not quite there, fast forward more, oh, you went too far, then rewind, and eventually get to the song you actually wanted to listen to. Since it's digital code on here, the invention of the skip button became very handy. All you had to do was tell the CD player what set of code to listen to, and it could skip everything in between, which with the analog continuous nonstop, it was a lot more difficult to try and skip what was in between. So on the convenience side, that was definitely a benefit. All right, and again, it was very portable, just like our compact cassette was able to be portable. So before we could get to our DVD and our Blu-ray, 93 came up with an MP3 format. So the difference in the numbers that are relevant for MP3, if you remember the CDs had 44,100 samples of sound per second that were digitized. What an MP3 format does, it compresses the song. And it compresses it by eliminating or reducing it 10 to 12 times. That means not 10 to 12%, but 10 to 12 times smaller. So for simple math, if we're just going by the 10 times smaller, it turns 44,100 samples per second into 4,100 samples per second. Is that a significant reduction of information? Yes, it's 10 times less, or basically 90% is gone. Yes?
So does it cut out the code, or does it just kind of like minimize it?
It does a little bit of both. because as it's compressing it, so it does minimize it some, but as it's simplifying the code, there's not as much of that sound information that's being replicated. And the process itself, I don't fully understand, but from what I do understand, it's kind of a little bit of both that happens. And that's why 30 megabytes can be turned into 3 megabytes. And it's also why people who have a good ear for sound can tell the difference between the high quality or high sample rate recording versus the MP3, which is the one that's typically streamed if you stream music and or store music on your phones. It's usually that MP3 format because less storage space on your phone needed, less streaming data needed, so by like 90% less. So that's the significance of the MP3 or compressed format. Eliminates most of the information